to. Right, I'm going to come to you now for your questions and contributions from the floor. Please put your hand up if you've got a question. We'll take 3 in a go. Okay, we've got one woman there in the red top. Who's got the microphone? Quickly. Thanks. Sorry, I'm going to be hard on this because I want to get the questions. Have you got more than one mic? I hope we have. Oh, okay. Right, you're going to have to run. Yeah. Carry on.
Quick questions.
Okay, thanks very much for that. There's a question that I need an answer to, and I'm hoping that you can help with this, because I work in a healthcare sector where pay is calculated on piecework, and there's a 20% pay gap. It tends to be that the women spend longer per patient, but put in the same hours. So how would you counter an argument that they should therefore be paid less?
Okay. Next question down here. There was a hand. Okay, woman there. Yep. Then we're going to have to go round the other side. Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to raise a broader issue. I'm totally sold on we have to fight on equal pay. I've been involved in 2 cases with my university employer. One was about gender discrimination, which wasn't to do with pay, and recently more to do with pay, which wasn't so much to do explicitly with gender. The first one, I get no trade union legal support because it's subtle, it's difficult to prove, and we're not 50% likely to win. And this second one, where there's numbers, and you can add them up and divide them and subtract them, I get quite good legal support for something that's not nearly so important to me. So I'm clear we need to fight on pay, and pay is a real manifestation of our value. But it tends to be women in high-paid jobs who are able to do this, for whom it's clear it's happening. And we end up perhaps altering the pay structure so we all get the same salaries. And then we're buying into a pay structure which has fundamentally been set up by men, which creates great income inequality, which is bad for us all. And how do we work our way through those things? I think we may have to do equal pay first, but in doing that, I'm feeling slightly uncomfortable that I don't actually want that extra salary. What I want is to be equally valued and equally respected. That's the only way I can demand it, if you like, and that doesn't feel right.
Okay, great, thank you. Right, run round and round the other side. Pass it like a baton, fantastic. Okay, woman at the back with a hand up.
I was going to say we're probably two.
It's okay, there's 2 of us next to each other. So I completely agree with the panel. There's so many interconnected issues when it comes to gender pay, and they need to be done in a structured fashion, but all of them have an impact on each other. I was wondering if there is a opinion or a plan or some sort of suggestion of which issues to tackle first and in what order to have the greatest impact on each other. I'll just pass over.
Okay, for me, I'd like to question at the very core of it, I'm not close enough, for us to get equal opportunity or equal rights, we need to do something about how we can access the law or the employment tribunal or anything like that so that we're on an equal footing to the people we're taking on. Otherwise, we will never have our voice heard in a legal way, in a legal framework for that to change.
Brilliant. Okay. I'm going to come back to the panel now. Carrie, do you want to pick up the first point about pay, value, the sort of more systemic questions?
So that is a very difficult, it's a very difficult issue, obviously. And we have, we at the BBC have had a lot of experience over the past year or so of trying to, get through this treacle of somebody saying, well, this is worth more than this, and, we're the boss, so who are you? And you can spend 3 years taking us to tribunal, which you can't even access, so good luck to you. So I suppose in answer to your question about how you deal with questions of value around time spent with a patient, so that your piecework, you're spending longer, you're earning less. I think it's a conversation with an employer, and you can kind of take that out into a lot of different situations. You basically have to discuss, do you value this? On what basis are you asserting value for this person, this apple, this orange, this piece of work, that activity. What makes you, I mean, in my case, it was what makes you value Washington, D.C. at twice China? You know, that was just my issue. But your issue, it's actually, for all of us, it's down to a detailed, nitty-gritty, brave conversation about what makes up value. And we all have to do it. I think everybody has to be brave and engage in that conversation. So you're valuing, so you have to know what your comparator is paid. So good, it sounds like you do. So that's step one. And then you have to say, okay, so how are you justifying that gap? Piecework's kind of slightly separate issue for some people, but we all have to go, measure the gap? How do you justify it? You say you've given me some flexibility so I can look after my kids on a Thursday. Is that flexibility really worth paying him double? You know, it's those kinds of conversations. So I suppose that's not a really very useful, detailed answer in terms of the piecework, but I think it's really a hard, nitty-gritty conversation about where the value lies.
Thanks very much. Joe and Julie, do you want to come back on any of those points? I mean, what about the kind of what do we tackle first? But what's our priority? I always think that's a really hard one.
Well, I would say that we do need to be tackling everything, and I kind of first. So I would almost throw it back to, I think what an individual should aim to tackle first is the thing that they either care about the most or the thing that they perhaps feel that where they have the most influence over, because that way we can be most effective. So I think it's quite hard to do a hierarchy of, well, you know, you do this issue and then you sort that and then you get this issue, because the issues are so interconnected. And therefore, I think an approach of, you know, choose the thing that really makes you feel passionate and makes you angry and go for that, because you will be more successful in tackling that because you really feel very strongly about it. Or indeed, you know, if you are, you know, an HR director or a chief executive of a company, then actually, you know, revamping those policies is probably the way that you can make the most difference. So I think for each individual to look at themselves and say, right, okay, well, where's the bit I'm going to do, rather than feeling as an individual that you have to do everything.
I'm going to go to Catherine next and then come back to you, Julie. Yep.
I just wanted to come to add to that point on priorities. I agree with what Joe said. I don't think that you can cherry pick here because of the interconnectedness of these things. But I think we also have to ask what we mean by priorities and where they come from. And this is where I'll go back to the media point. You know, we had Sam saying that her story isn't out there because of Brexit, because Brexit is so important, right? Brexit is this big male thing that's so important. Nobody actually talks about Brexit in its gendered impacts. Nobody actually understands what it really is for women. And this notion, this hierarchy of what's supposed to be important, something that those of us in journalism will absolutely know. You know, wars are important. Stories about social care aren't important. You know, all of these things are important. So what we actually have to do is we have to challenge the notion of what priorities even are, who sets them, who are the gatekeepers for all of this. We need to, this is why we need equality in the media as well as all of these other things, but we have to really understand where this is coming from and call it out for what it is, because, you know, these things are all massive priorities. They are urgent. And the other thing is, we've got to get rid of the idea that this is a conversation about women for women. Yeah. We constantly in this trap of talking about women's issues when they're actually affecting every single person, the whole economy.
Julie, do you want to just come in on, you know, how do we make sure that when we're talking about in those sort of big headline terms that we don't miss out on the needs of BME women, disabled women, you know, younger women, older women? If we're in that challenge, we want to find the common ground and unite together, but we don't want to overlook the differences, because if we do that, then we're not meeting the needs of those different women. So how do we do that?
Yeah. I think that it's very challenging. It's a very challenging area. Just working in that area myself is very challenging for my staff, where they're advocating for Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, disabled people, carers and older people to access services that anyone should be able to access. Now, one of the things that people are finding extremely difficult is access to employment. And that's even to be employed at the most lowest level as a cleaner, let's just say. And I'm not disrespecting any cleaners, but it is a very low level job. And I just believe, and my staff, I see the challenges for them every single day when we've got queues and queues of people waiting to know what their rights are to access housing, to access further education, to go to a GP and to say that, you know, I don't feel very well, and being faced with a male GP and having to talk about a gynae issue. There are lots and lots of areas that are very challenging to put it all together. However, there is a way, and the way is collaborative working. It's about making sure that we are inclusive, because I think even in the disability movement, there are issues there. That's not totally inclusive. In a lot of the black and minority ethnic groups, they're not very inclusive to disabled people. And then we've got BME people that are LGBT, come from LGBT communities. They are being discriminated against. And so I think that if we're going to do anything, firstly, it's looking at the inclusion of all, of everybody, and those of us that have sons, is to make sure that that son grows up as a man that respects everything about a woman.
Okay, I'm going to take another round of questions, I think, and then I'll come to you first, Gillian, I promise, on the next round. So, Tanya, with a hand up, I happen to know Tanya, so I'm going to give her first dibs.
Hi. Great conference, one of the best, thank you. It's a question, it's actually picking off something that Catherine and then Julie started talking about, which is the role of men in this. Because I think it was really interesting, particularly in Carrie's case, that this was set up as a dichotomy in order for you and women in the BBC to get your value, men had to be paid less. And it was made really, really personal. These particular men are taking pay cuts, so because of you. And how do we make it clear that actually the BBC's job was to pay people equally, and it shouldn't always be. It's something that all of us face, not just women. And how do we make men aware of their responsibilities because about sharing and being open about how much they earn compared to us, and recognising that sometimes there is going to be a loss, but overall it's good for us all.
Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to come down here now.
Hi, so this is probably directed to Gillian. With the glory of Brexit coming up, Lord help us all, and we're talking about disrupting and challenging, and we mentioned about how Co-op wasn't paying anything and it didn't cost them. To how far should we take it without sacrificing our entire economy and making life terrible for everyone, not just for women? So yeah, we'll get equality, but it's a bad equality because everyone's worse off. So how can we get equality but in a good way and disrupt but with positive results?
Okay, which is kind of connected to Tanya's question, I think. Right, we're going to come round here. Who's got a hand up? Woman here with glasses, then I'll come to you at the back. No, sorry. I will try and get as many of you in as I can, but carry on.
Hi there. I was very touched by what Sam and Carrie were talking about to do with the Employment Tribunal. I've been through it myself. It was a very difficult experience. But I don't see, with all due respect to the fantastic work Fawcett Society is doing, I don't see assisting women to get to the Employment Tribunal as I see it as a cure rather than as a preventative step. And I think, well, this is my question. Does the panel think that as a preventative step, what we need to be campaigning for is a super regulator on equal pay So do we need to be giving an existing government department some real teeth here to enforce the existing legislation, to impose huge fines? The Financial Conduct Authority comes to mind, a semi-public, semi-private organisation which is funded by its members. It regulates huge financial institutions and ensures that they comply with regulations to ensure the markets operate properly. Should we be campaigning for similar emphasis in the equal pay world, so that employers pay an amount to an organisation which they buy membership to, and then those funds are used to push employers into paying people equally?
Okay, brilliant. Right, we're going to come to the man at the back. I'm going to get a man into the questions, and then we're going to come back to the panel. We, of course, do have the EHRC, whose job it is to enforce the law, who need to, yeah, we need penalties. I always compare it to GDPR and the worry I have about, going wrong with data now as an employer. Massive fine, yeah, but nothing equivalent on equality. Yes, carry on.
Hello. As you can probably tell from me, I'm from Scotland. My question is about the equal pay case that Glasgow City Council girls, or bound for that matter, have against the council, and I think that's an ongoing case at the moment. I'm not quite sure where it is in its positivity or non-direction, as the case may be, but obviously I'm in support of no matter who it is, be it ladies or men, and I wanted to know what your opinions on the Glasgow City case was.
Put the microphone down a bit so we can't hear you very well. Yeah, carry on. That's it. Just lower it slightly. That's
sorry, is that better?
Yeah.
Oh, excuse me, sorry. I just wondered what your thoughts on the Glasgow City Council, the case
I've got
against.
A lot of thoughts on that.
Yeah. It's an ongoing case, but I hope it's got a good resolution. But
so you've made a very important point, because there are a number of live big action cases at the moment. We're representing low-paid women on equal value claims. Stephen Cross is a big supporter of Fawcett, and we give a shout out to him. He's put money into us, he's supported us, he's leading on some of those claims. A number of unions are involved in the Glasgow case as well. It's been going on probably over 10 years, I think. It's a very long time.
Yeah, it's a considerable
Jaye
time.
are here as well today. They're representing supermarket women in Asda, a number of others, Tesco, a number of supermarkets. So there are a lot of low-paid women also fighting on equal value claims. Absolutely. I'm going to come back to the panel now, because we're going to run out of time. So I just want us to pick up on the questions about how do we get men to, share the information, bring men with us, don't present it as a kind of zero-sum game. Gillian, let me come to you first, because you didn't get in on the first round.
That's all right. What they did in the case of Carrie's case was so divisive, wasn't it? It was really designed to be very divisive, and I think that's, that created more of a problem possibly as well. Tanya, I think, asked the question. I think Tanya knows my own fabulous husband, who is, very much always out there supporting women and women in the corporate world, and has even been, given some awards by it. But there aren't many, and I often think, why is he like that and not like one of the other type that I obviously am surrounded by a lot? And it's because I think he was brought up by a single mum who basically was left high and dry, who basically had to work all the hours God sends to look after him. And that was the story, and that's what he saw, and that was his inspiration. And I think, he's an only child, so he didn't have any sort of double dose of testosterone or anything like that to cope with either. So, but I think it is very important. And I was trying to think of what, the question, what do we really prioritise? What do we focus on? And I think it really comes down to the increase in transparency. And whilst you were talking, Sam, just something I was writing down, we need more transparency, more questions. We have more questions than answers. But we need recourse and regulatory teeth. And I wrote that down when I was sat listening to you over there. And I think, and we need to call out the bad behaviour, compromise agreements being used. Grades, there's so many places for this to hide. Grades, grading schemes, bonuses, piecework, geography in your case, Carrie. And then, of course, we've got the whole underlying drivers of, why women don't necessarily keep on the earning scale that we might start off on, and that's all around parental shared leave, equality, just, you know, all the fundamental things that are wrong. So I think, you know, I guess we need to have massively increased transparency, and we need to think about the regulatory teeth. I think that's where you focus, because from that flows everything else. Asking the questions about how are these grades structured? No one really asks that. They ask them within companies, but not from outside a company. And they're quite complex, and the more complexity, the more that you can hide behind many, many different things. And I'm sure that's what you found in your job. So I think that's where we really need to focus, how we make it more transparent, and then how we get some ability to enforce afterwards.
Okay, brilliant. I'm just going to work my way along. Catherine.
I agree with all of that. I think also, you know, to go back to that education point and the question around men and where men are. Yes, the point about men brought up in a way that they understand that this is also about them, that it, you know, that it's better for them as well. I just thought it was worth dropping another rather prominent pay disparity into this conversation rather late in the day. The co-founder of the Women's Equality Party with me is Sandy Toksvig. At our party conference, she revealed publicly for the first time that she had recently discovered that she's paid 40% less for presenting QI than Stephen Fry was. 40%. I haven't noticed Stephen Fry coming out to support her being paid equally. And what I did see was a lot of discussion about whether Sandy was equal to Stephen Fry, that he could have very easily done so. So, you know, I don't know where his head is on this, but I think that there are very easy moments of solidarity that men can show. It would cost them literally nothing to do so. But I do think, as I say, that there is some of this is baked into our culture in really unhelpful ways. There are great male allies out there, but the really big thing is for men to understand that this is about them too.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. Which I'll tackle the men one briefly as well. So I think we need to somehow engage empathy from men, and we also need to shame them. Both things need to happen. So I'm grateful to Joe for having a go at John Humphrys, and actually I was very interested in his answers, which were, you know, surprise to me, because he said to Joe, in that, when Joe came back at him on the Today programme, he said that he had written to me immediately after the exchange. That's not how I remember it. He wrote to me after he'd had conversations with management, and management had obviously required him and John Sopel to apologise to me, so they both wrote within the same 5-minute period on the 3 days after the event. During the same 5 minutes, I got 2 emails, one from John Sopel, one from John Humphrys, and I got a call from a senior manager basically checking that I wasn't going to take it any further. So that's thanks to you, but you know. So I think that the men on the value question, the Sandy versus Stephen Fry, it's really interesting how some people just hear value when they hear a man's voice and cannot. I'm much, you know, I mean, I'm not got nothing against Stephen Fry, but, you know, I was really interested to see the social media commentary, which said, but he's Stephen Fry. As if, you know, paying. So she was getting 40% of his 100, wasn't she? So she was 60% less than him, if I remember rightly. Was that it, Catherine? I think it was. Anyway, it was a very big chunk. And it was like, okay, because he's Stephen Fry, he's worth that kind of disparity. And I suffered the same kind of comments about, you know, and I speak Mandarin. I've worked for 30 years. It's a police state. Are you kidding me? To walk down to the railings of the White House? I can do that thing. John Opal is a great reporter. I've got nothing, one of the sad things about these situations is it pits you against your colleagues.
Yes.
And it was divisive the way it was handled at the BBC, which made that an equal pay dispute does pit colleagues against each other in a really, really unpleasant way. And it's one of the things that puts you off taking it on. And then if the employer makes it worse, that's really tough. So I had nothing against John Soper. But what I would say about all those top men is they could have done the solidarity thing.
Yeah. Could.
And they chose not to. And that's why I say it's partly reaching out to get men to empathise, and it's partly actually saying to the ones who don't, do you know what? We're in the 21st century now, and that's not acceptable.
Julie, give us your take.
I agree with everything the panel said. I just want to know how the toilets work.
There's a resounding yes. We're coming to an end. Yeah, men's and women's. Coming to an end. 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Can you hang on for 2 minutes?
Yeah.
Oh, you're all right.
Yeah.
Okay. Joe, give us your take to finish us off.
I think the Glasgow City Council case...
Take the microphone a bit closer, sorry.
Yes. I think the Glasgow City Council case really goes to the heart of how men's work and women's work is valued, and that's why it is so totemic and fascinating. And on the issue of enforcement, therefore, I mean, I would entirely agree that, nobody really wants to go to an employment tribunal, right? I'm delighted the fees have been scrapped, but nobody really wants to go there, because even without the fees, it is costly in terms of time, in terms of money, in terms of emotional energy for everybody involved. So sometimes it's necessary and it needs to be there, but I think we do need better enforcement. And actually, I would argue that not just a regulator on equal pay, I would argue that we need to have more proactive labour market enforcement. Having experienced 3 years as Employment Relations Minister, actually, the stuff that we did on the national minimum wage, which is the only bit of employment law that is enforced by the state, we were able to create a lot more success, both in terms of serious fines, but also, I think, perhaps one of the most successful things was we introduced naming and shaming. And certainly for household names of companies, that is one of the biggest sticks that we had. And I think that is successful, and it's a model we should look at more widely for employment law, including for discrimination and equal pay. And then just on the men thing, I mean, I wrote a whole book about gender equality, and I was like, I have to do a chapter on men, because you always get that what about men question. And I started it with this visual of Google searches for International Men's Day. And as you would expect, there's a bit of a spike around about November the 19th. It's on Monday, International Men's Day. But by far and away, the biggest spike every year for searches for International Men's Day on International Women's Day. And if you haven't ever followed Richard Herring on Twitter on International Women's Day, you should start. But, I mean, basically, that what about men thing, I think, it sort of pits men against women. And I think it's not what we need, because I think gender equality is better for everybody. And one of the ways I try to frame that to get men to understand it is I say, look, most gender inequality negatively impacts women and girls, but some of it negatively impacts men and boys. And particularly if you think about the way in which we have stereotypes about talking about emotions and the impact on men's mental health, or if you think about the way in which men's role as fathers is diminished and they are finding it harder to get flexibility in the workplace, for example, and people think that they are pretty useless when it comes to being dads, all of that stuff negatively impacts men and boys. And so if we can join together as an inclusive campaign for gender equality, we will all benefit. And I've found that sometimes gets traction, because I think when you have men against women, we're just never going to win that battle. We have to be working together.
Absolutely. Right. Brilliant. Thank you.